of introducing our moderator, Mr. Barrie Zwicker. Michelle Landsberg, former colleague of Barrie's at the Globe and Mail, longtime Toronto Star and Chatelaine magazine columnist, and wife of former NDP leader Stephen Lewis, who was also the ambassador to the United Nations. From her 2003 Toronto Sun column, Toronto Star, sorry. He's got a penchant for details and facts. In defense of our moderator, starts with, Barrie Zwicker gazes calmly into the camera, hands clasped, voice clear and resonant, looking the quintessential Canadian progressive. Colorful knitted vest or blue suit jacket, over an open collar shirt, a neat little beard, a personality that radiates boyish, almost naive friendliness, not a shred of irony, not a sliver of petulant, up-to-date narcissism. Perfect. You couldn't possibly be more agreeable and less threatening. Then, of course, he ruins it by asking questions. They are the questions that 99% of Canadian journalists have not dared to ask, and that most Canadians would prefer not to hear. Barrie Zwicker has been a staff writer at a variety of newspapers in Canada and the United States, including the Detroit News, the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, where he won several awards with Education Writers of North America. He taught the Media and Society course at Ryerson and worked for Vision TV as the media critic from 1988 to 2003. In January 2002, Barrie was the first journalist in the world to go on national TV and seriously question the official version of 9/11. Barrie also wants us to know he's been married for 51 years to the same woman, the former Jean Muzzle of ONeill. Barrie and Jeannie are committed environmentalists. They gave up car ownership 48 years ago. During the 8th decade of his life, he biked across Canada in 6 stages, starting from Vancouver Island, joined by his son for the final stretch from Quebec City to Halifax. Near the end of Michelle Landsberg's column, she writes, "His energy seems equaled only by his good humor and relentless pursuit of honest fact." Still going strong half a year into his 9th decade, Mr. Barrie Zwicker.
Thank you for your too kind and too long introduction. And about cars, after I looked at that Tesla S out front here, if I win a big lottery, I am buying a Tesla. Now, Paul himself deserves an introduction. And those of you who know Paul, and you may also owe some of your good health to him, won't need me to burnish his halo. But for those who don't know him, I'd like to say that Paul is one of those rare and precious professionals who go well beyond their discipline to seek out the truth and then to act on it, even if it's unpopular. There are very few professionals in any field who could meet that description that is perfect for Paul. And I know him as generous and fun to be with, and tremendously up to date on a whole variety of issues. And if the world were his patient, it would be healed in short order. Now, here's a timeline that we'd like to stick with this afternoon, and Paul started bang on 2 o'clock, the way we were supposed to, so that sets quite a something to hold up to. After a few introductory remarks of my own, which I think are 3.5 or so minutes, which I've been asked to make, I'll introduce Geoff ONeill, who's sitting there, and he gets 30 minutes allotted to him, as do the other two speakers. After Geoff will be Graeme and MacQueen. They'll each be introduced before they speak. Then we take a 15-minute coffee break. And then following that coffee break, you'll be introduced to Amy MacPherson, who's sitting here. And she will be the third and final speaker. We should have time for a good, full question, answer, and discussion session after Amy has spoken to you. So I actually asked Paul and Graeme for advice as to what I might share with you by way of setting the stage here this afternoon. And Paul wrote me out a prescription. I mean, not literally, with nothing on it. So I took that to mean that I should follow the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. So I'll try to follow that. And then what Graeme said, when I asked him, he said, and I quote, "It's my job to create a calm and attentive space into which we, the speakers, can enter." Well, that's fine for a Buddhist to say. And maybe I'll do no harm to your hope, Graeme. But frankly, considering the events and the forces that our speakers this afternoon will be dealing with, and the course of world events as I understand them, calm, as in serene and tranquil, isn't the first word that springs to my mind. My own perspective is that in my 81st year, I have mainly been lied to all my life. Deceived and betrayed, as the poster has it. Now, not by my parents, and not by my inner light, but by religion to some extent, by schooling a lot, but mainly I've been lied to by the mainstream media. And that may seem odd, since, as you picked up from the introduction, I've been a journalist all my life. It's been my career. It's what I've done. So it's odd, but I've evolved from a media worker to a media critic. And now I've become a whistleblower on my calling. And to briefly explain that will then lead into the rest of what I have to share with you about this afternoon's events. The internet has opened up many new channels of communication, and mainly they're welcome. And yet it remains stubbornly the case that it is still from the mainstream media that most people get most of their information on most subjects most of the time. It is still the mainstream media that set the daily informational agenda for the human race. Now, Peter Russell, a British author, invented the term the global brain, and he wrote a book of that title in 1982. I think he was ahead of his time in talking about this kind of global consciousness that is now increasingly made possible by the infosphere, by all these multiple channels of communication. So, if Peter Russell's global brain is informed by the global media, then something that another Englishman, E.P. Thompson, said comes into sharp focus. He wrote, "The deformed human mind is the ultimate doomsday machine." So here's why this incredible power of the media is so important. To point it out is precisely the same as pointing out that those who control the media essentially decide what we think. And those who control the media are a tiny fraction of humanity, less than 1%. But that tiny fraction constitutes the most powerful, wealthy, and privileged among us. And it's their agenda, which is endless greed, the compulsion to dominate, and the willingness to brazenly deceive, nonstop, that forms the molds for the fabricated, manufactured product we call news and information. Now, it works by a bait and switch operation, meaning that much of what we call the news is factual and often entertaining, whether it's about cat videos or local or even federal government or even international politics. And you can even catch glints of important, generally hidden truths in fugitive paragraphs. But this is all bait. The switch is the black hole of omission, de facto censorship on the outsized consequential picture, and that is the global proto-fascist military corporate propaganda domination project and its moving parts, such as deeply concealed planning of when wars will be started and how, and when they will be stopped and why, and who will profit from the destruction and the reconstruction. There's the invisible planning of those whose resources will be stolen and for whose benefit. There's the media cover-up of visible war-triggering deceptions, rendering them in effect invisible. And only one example is really required to prove all this beyond reasonable doubt. That example is 9/11, by which I mean the across-the-board, controlled blacking out of the abundant, reliable, scientific evidence that the events of that day were a brazen false flag operation, a history-changing inside job. And for 14 years now, here's my proof, the media have not even questioned the official story of 9/11, let alone investigated it, or even called for a proper investigation. That's all you need to know to get the general slant on whom the mainstream media serve. The hidden cabal of war makers and war profiteers and resource thieves, to put it bluntly. If 9/11 were opened up, as some of us have been working toward to the best of our ability for some time now, it would expose the tiny ruling elite for what they have done and what they are about and the abyss to which they are leading us. It opened up with 9/11 and the 9/11 wars and the so-called global war on terror, planned as a perpetual war and propaganda machine. More or less what Hitler had in mind for his 1,000-year Reich. If enough people cannot learn enough fast enough and take the needed actions to block it, we're destined to be deceived and betrayed ever deeper into the Fourth Reich. And like most of the Jews of Europe in the years leading up to the Third, failure to heed the signs will lead to a very dark place. So, with that calming thought, let me introduce our first speaker, Geoff ONeill. Now, Geoff, it's hard to believe, is venturing forward on his first public speaking engagement, so he says. And how he put this off for so long, he has really no explanation apart from, oh shit. Anyway, he's driven all the way from Silver Spring, Maryland, to be here. Born in the States, he spent his early years there, but later he followed his parents to Canada. I don't know why they moved to Arm prior. That's another story, I guess. In his senior year at Port Credit High School, he was named Athlete of the Year. He moved to Mississauga and remained active in sports, and indeed he's active in sports to this day. During the Vietnam War, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps and went to Vietnam. Post-war, he completed a BA at Villanova University in Philadelphia. It's the reverse?
BA is first and war.
Okay, sorry. Got to get my facts straight. First BA, then war. I hope that not cause any effect. Since then, since his return, he's been a businessman and recently tennis instructor at a major facility Perhaps most importantly and most relevant for this afternoon, he's a member of the Iraq Veterans Against the War and a member at large of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. So please welcome Geoff ONeill.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm a little odd about being around people like Graeme and Barrie and Mimi. They're awesome. You know, I'm sitting there with my mouth open all weekend. It's been great. Our topic today is the global war on terror betrayal. Well, a war is a betrayal if it's a lie, if it's illegal. There's two treaties on the books in the United States. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, signed into law in 1928, and the Geneva Accord, the UN Charter. Both treaties, both supreme laws of the land, they both condemn war unless they're for defensive purposes. The global war on terror consists of Iraq, Afghanistan, all the proxy wars in the Middle East, and God knows how many countries, all the drone murders that I like to call them because that's what they are. And how could anyone in their right mind consider those to be defensive in nature? It's just ridiculous. So yes, in my view, and I think many of us share that view, the global war on terror is a complete betrayal, not only to me, but to everybody. I'm a little reluctant to talk about my Vietnam experience, but I'm going to, but in a different way that you might think. I'm going to tell some more stories, but they're not going to be the type of war stories that involve any violence. The system, I found out very early in the U.S., was rigged. It was rigged against low-income and middle-income families. When I got out to my unit in 1968, I shook hands with about 80 guys, and about 75 of them were 18 or 19 years old. And they were all from low-income families. And that started me down a real bad rabbit hole, because I thought this whole thing is rigged. It's rigged against these kids. And they were expendable. You know, like, you explain that you have poor kids out there, and they get killed, and get sent home in a body bag. It's a non-event to the government. You replace that with a rich kid, and he gets sent home in a body bag. His father goes down to the Pentagon and says, "Oh, I want a complete detail about what happened to my son." That's the way it works. And that's why they don't send those guys out there, because they're expendable. They're throwaways. But guess what? They are not throwaways. They're special. They're absolutely special. I am so proud to serve with these guys. It was amazing. So I'm going to tell you a couple of war stories. But like I said, they're going to be personal interest stories, not violence. You might think a couple of them might be funny. I hope. The first one, I was about 3 weeks in country, and we were on a patrol. Point platoon got lost, and so we had to wade through rice paddies. And sometimes they were trying to get their bearings out in front of us. They had to stop and figure it out. So we're stuck in this rice paddy, and it was hot. It's always hot in Vietnam, except during monsoon. So it was quite uncomfortable, to say the least. The water was sludgy, full of leeches, and I turned around, and I saw this young guy behind me. He was about 5'6". He had a med pack on his shoulder. He was a corpsman from the Navy. And I said, "You having a good time yet?" He says, "I'm having a blast, sir." So we get clear of the rice paddies in this clear areas, and we all just down to our underwear, wringing out our clothes and cleaning off the leeches. And he was next to me, And I said to him, how the hell did you get out of here? From the Navy. He said, well, I got my draft notice right out of high school. He was 18, goes down to the place where he's supposed to enroll, and there were 30 people there. He lined up on one end, and they started a count off at the other. So there was 1, 2 down to 30. He was number 30. So the sergeant said, 1 through 28, you go into that door. You're going into the Army, 29 and 30. Wait here, because somebody from the Navy's going to pick you up. He thought he won the lottery. So he's out there in a Marine Rifle Company in the middle of nowhere carrying a medical pack. I said, you did win the lottery, didn't you? He said, you bet I did, pal. Or sir, he didn't say pal. He said, sir, you bet. And it's just that attitude. It was just pervasive. The conditions in Vietnam were never anything but extreme. The temperature, during the hot times of semi-tropical climate, 102, 105 degrees with 95 degree humidity, and then during the monsoons it rained all the time. So it was one extreme to the other, and I never heard anyone complain. The second story I'm going to tell you is about this young guy. He was an African-American kid, and he was extraordinary, quiet. He was a squad leader. And we were out humping in a fairly clear area in some hilly terrain. And because military intelligence, and I use that as an oxymoron, said that there was a VC unit out there somewhere, and we needed to chase them down. Well, it was ridiculous because they would never charge us on equal to equal, because we were just blown away. They were very good, but they acted when it suited them, when they had advantage, not in a situation like that. So we're out there in vain, running around for 2 hours hot, everybody's got sweat running down their shirts. And so we stopped for a little break, and I put my pack down, and I noticed a pack a couple of feet from me that was like this. It was loaded. And I was telling Barrie this morning, he had a helmet, flak jacket, a rifle, water, ammunition. You do not want a heavy pack. You put in there the least bit that you can. This guy had a pack that was like wide, straight to the rim. And I said to him, and his name was Stanley, I said, Stanley, well, what do you got in there? And he says, I got food. I said, why do you do that? We get resupplied every day. He said, yeah, but sometimes when it rains, they don't come out. And I gotta have food for my boys. Now, think of this. He's a black kid, quiet. He, the squad leader, 2/3 of his squad were white kids. And he was worried about them so they'd have enough food to eat. And I said, do you mind if I pick up their pack? He said, no. Oh my God. He's humping this thing around for everywhere we go. And I thought, geez, so his boys would have some food. And I looked at him and I just shook my head and laughed. And I mean, that's it, is this guy expendable? Yeah. So the third one was during the rainy season, and it was raining constantly. Well, not constantly. It would drizzle, it would rain, it would clear up for a couple hours and start over. And it was tough for the helicopters to get out and resupply us with food. So this one occasion, we were out there, and it had been about 2 days because it had rained pretty hard, and food was scarce. So we got up into this hilly area, and the captain said we were going to spend the night there. And what we would do is we jury rig some kind of a tent to cover our head and shoulders, so that the rain, when you're sleeping, the rain didn't smack down on your face. So I was figuring my thing out, and one of the privates next to me said, "Look at this." So this young guy was pulling out a tapeworm from his nose, big, long tapeworm, and it was a it was like watching a train wreck. You couldn't take your eyes off. So he finally got it out. You know, I could tell the fish door, I'd say it was 10 feet long. It probably wasn't nearly that big. He finally got it out, and I thought he was going to freak out. And he looks over to us and he says, "How was that?" And you know, he said, we all started laughing. And then you see the ridiculous situation. These guys don't know what they were over there for. There was nothing political. They get their draft notes. They don't go. I ran into a guy a couple weeks ago at a protest, and I've never done this, but I was proud to do it. And we were walking down in Washington, and I come up to him, and he had a Veterans Against the War poster. I said, "When were you in?" He says, "I was never in." I said, "Well, what are you doing here?" He said, "Well, I was a draft resister, and they sent me to a federal penitentiary 1,000 miles away from his home for 2 years for saying no because he didn't want to kill Vietnamese." So that's how this whole thing is written. It's really sad. Anyway, that's the extent of my Vietnam experience, and so we'll move on to some other thing. You still there? We're going to start with the Iraq War, which to me is one of the biggest boondoggles in history of the United States, at least in the 21st century. It's just awful. The entire world was horrified that the U.S. was preparing to invade Iraq. On February 15th, 2003, an estimated 15 million people assembled and marched in more than 600 cities to say no to the war in Iraq. Pope John XXIII made 52 public appearances, calling the war a crime against peace. This was all ignored. We never saw this in the United States because they blocked it out, but it was going on globally. And it was all ignored. Early in September, it was in September 2002, this is several months after the Afghan wars got started, Andrew Carter, who was Bush's chief of staff, formed a group called the White House Iraq Group. These guys were Washington insiders, Brooks Brothers suits. They came to the White House every Monday, sat around and brainstormed how they could convince the American people to support the war in Iraq. And every time I say that, I can't believe it. These people that are warmongers would never have kids near their recruiting office. And they're creating a war that didn't exist, a cause for a war that didn't exist. Two nonprofit journalism groups, Center for Public Integrity and the Fund for Independent Journalism, conducted a study. And according to the study, Bush and 7 top officials made 935 false statements to promote the war in Iraq. 935 lies, so that they'd get an opportunity to go to the war. Okay, part of the lies was, I'm going to show you a little video clip of George Bush in his 2003 State of the Union message. And he's treating Adolf Hitler in his message, or Saddam Hussein in his message like Adolf Hitler on steroids. Go ahead and watch it.
Just tell me when you want me to turn it
I
off.
will.
Year after year, Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths, spent enormous sums, taken great risks to build and keep weapons of mass destruction. But why? The only possible explanation, the only possible use he could have for those weapons is to dominate, intimidate, or attack. With nuclear arms or a full arsenal of chemical and biological weapons, Saddam Hussein could resume his ambitions of conquest in the Middle East and create deadly havoc in that region. And this Congress and the American people must recognize another threat. Evidence from intelligence sources, secret communications, and statements by people now in custody reveal that Saddam Hussein aids and protects terrorists, including members of Al-Qaeda.
Pretty convincing, huh? Everything he said there was a lie. Everything. Problem is, he's got the bully pulpit, and after 9/11, people were scared. But everything he said there was a lie. It was maybe 7 weeks after it was found that they did not have weapons of mass destruction. They did not have a nuclear program. They did not have ties to Al-Qaeda. So, you think a guy who unleashed the American military on the country of Baghdad and found out that the whole cause for what he was phony, and it was made public because there just weren't any weapons there, might have a little bit of humiliation, remorse, maybe a ton of guilt. Well, you'd be wrong. The next video you're going to see is George Bush at the correspondence dinner in 2004. This is this is a kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing where people are kidding around and making jokes, and only the Washington elite are at this gathering. You won't see anybody but. And this is George Bush talking about weapons of mass destruction. Watch this.
And with that, it is now my pleasure and honor to introduce the President of the United States, George W. Bush.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I present a White House election year album. This is on the way to the G8 Summit. Once I got these trading cards, it's easy to remember the names of the foreign leaders. Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere. Nope, no weapons over there. Maybe under here.
I don't know about you, but to me that is narcissistic evil. I don't know any other words for that. The next little clip you're going to see is a soldier. He enlisted to go to Afghanistan and capture Osama bin Laden. That was his mission. That was his goal, especially after he saw the attacks. And he was just a young patriot who wanted to do his thing. After his training ended, though, the focus is switched to Iraq, and he was sent there against his will. But and I hope everybody hears this. When you sign on to the military, you don't get a chance to fight which war you think is right. They just send you to where they want you to go. And this is a tiny little bit of what happens what can happen to a young guy when he goes into that meat grinder.
And we've just learned that anti-war activist and Iraq War veteran Thomas Young died at the age of 34. He was wounded and paralyzed in 2004 during the U.S.-led campaign in Iraq. Upon returning home, Young became one of the first to openly oppose the invasion and was a guest on several TV shows. Last year, he spoke to RT and shared his message to the American people.
I didn't jive with the Army policy very well. And the military is good for some, bad for some, and to make sure that your son or daughter understands that they don't get to decide when or where they go to war. It's rich, predominantly white men in the House and Senate that have the power to send children of other parents, but not their own children, off to die or be injured in a senseless war. And I'd like current and future politicians to make sure that every avenue of diplomacy and what have you are exhausted before sending young men and women off to death or serious injury.
He died a couple months later, at the age of 34. How are you doing on time, Barrie?
8 minutes.
8 minutes, okay. Okay,
And 23 seconds.
I better get going. Afghanistan is also one of the global war on terror, wars. Everybody thought this was a reasonable thing that pushed it. He was going to take go into Afghanistan and capture or kill the guy responsible for the 9/11 attacks. All the world leaders knew without a doubt that Osama bin Laden was guilty of masterminding the attacks. All had no doubt whatsoever, except every one of them said that the information they had, they couldn't tell us because it was classified. What about the FBI? The FBI most wanted webpage on Osama bin Laden does not list the 9/11 attacks as one of the crimes for which he is charged. Rex Toon from the FBI's chief of investigative publicity said that, and I quote, "The reason why 9/11 is not mentioned on bin Laden's webpage is because the FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. The FBI has no hard evidence connecting bin Laden to 9/11. Then FBI director, this was really beautiful. FBI Director Robert Mueller, in a speech delivered to the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco on April 19, 2003, said this, and I quote, "In our investigation, we have not uncovered a single piece of evidence, either here in the U.S. or in the treasure trove of information turned up in Afghanistan and elsewhere that mentioned any aspect of the 9/11 plot." And then he went on to say they were so good and so clever that they didn't leave any evidence. So you think about if you're in a courtroom and you're on a jury and there's a guy shackled to a chair and there's no spectators, there's no defense attorney, there's no prosecuting attorney. Judge walks in, points to the guy and says, "This is a really bad dude. He's guilty of all kinds of crimes, murder, bank robbery, rape, all of that. But we can't show you the evidence because it's classified." Or, consider this, 19 young, punky-looking guys sitting there shackled in the same scenario. Judge comes out and says, "These guys are a criminal gang. They're mayhem everywhere. But there's no evidence against them. But we know they did it, so you got to find them guilty." That's the same kind of thing with bin Laden. There's no evidence against these two. There's no evidence against Osama bin Laden in the public record for the attacks on the World Trade Center. None. And I wish somebody would prove me wrong, because if he did, I'd get out of this rabbit hole. But this was the start of the global war on terror, because Osama bin Laden masterminded the attacks. 19 Arab terrorists carried it out, and there's no evidence against any of them. So Afghanistan war is a complete fraud. Okay, I think I'm done, except I want to show one more video. And this is a father's or parent's nightmare. And I'll let the film speak for itself.
And pounding the floor, just saying how furious he was with the government. This was all for oil, it was all for not the best reasons, and he was totally angry. And then he told me how he was going to commit suicide, and he described to me how he was going to do it. I immediately called the vet center, and this wonderful angel answered. She did. And she got me to calm down. And she talked to Geoff, and Geoff called her back. And they actually spoke twice. Then later that night, Geoff came into the front room. And just like he did when he was a little boy, he asked if he could sit in my lap and rock. And we rocked for about 45 minutes in total silence. I didn't know he was saying goodbye. Anyways, we both got up. I stayed up till about 2 o'clock to make sure Geoff wouldn't wander through the house. And then I went to bed, but I had to get up for 5 o'clock to go to work. And then I came home. It was June 22nd, 2004. And I was on the phone to Joyce, and I was sharing with her. I could see from the front window that Geoff must be smoking in front of the fireplace again, and he was watching TV. I went in, and I couldn't find Geoff. But one of the things, the dog tags that Debbie spoke about, Geoff never took off those dog tags. And even his girlfriend had commented on it. And so what happened is, when I went into his room, I saw the dog tags neatly laying on his bed. These are the dog tags that Joyce wears now, every day. So I went out to the porch and went out to the backyard. But then when I was going past the cellar, I saw a light on it, and I saw a shrine. That's the only way to describe it. It was family pictures. But his platoon picture was in the middle. So I went downstairs, and my focus was on the pictures. And as I said, his platoon picture was in the middle, but it had blood on it. And then he had family pictures in a semicircle. And then that's when I saw Geoff from the corner of my eye. I thought he was standing. But then I saw the holes around his neck. I ran over there, and he was in my lap for the final time. And I gently lowered him down to the ground.
Before I stop, I want a special thanks to all of you for coming, and to Paul for putting this on, and your hospitality has been unreal. For having a chance to hang around with these brilliant people, even you, Barrie. That's a long story how I got here, but Graeme was very instrumental, and it was an honor for me to come up and talk to you guys. So thank you.
Mike didn't use his time, he had 9 seconds left. That was very meaningful to me. I hadn't seen a good deal of that. Thank you very much for sharing, Geoff, coming all this way and sharing in the way you have. Our next speaker is MacQueen, and he is no stranger to public speaking. And I can share with you that he prepared for today as if it were his first ever gig. He's very conscientious. But first, our hallmark of his life. A son of a United Church minister, it was in Buddhist studies that he received his PhD from Harvard University. He taught in the Religious Studies Department at McMaster University for 30 years. In 1989, he became the founding director of the Center for Peace Studies there. And he helped develop the university's BA program in peace studies. Now, his active peace-building efforts took him to Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, and he has contributed to the development of the Women's Peace Brigade in northern India. He took early retirement to devote his energy to peace and justice work. And he's been focusing for the past 10 years on the anomalies of 9/11, as he gently puts it. He's a member of the 9/11 Consensus Panel, co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies, and has written 4 research articles on the subject of 9/11. He recently published his book, The 2001 Anthrax Deception, The Case for a Domestic Conspiracy. And only a week ago, the foresight of Graeme's choice to write this book, and how many years did you spend working on it, Graeme? 2 years at least of work went into this book, and the foresight of his choice of this particular deception was spectacularly vindicated very recently, a week or so ago, when Richard Lambert, the agent in charge of the anthrax investigation, you'll all remember that, announced publicly that he, the chief of the investigation, was obstructed and impeded for 4 years in that investigation. And he was obstructed and impeded by the FBI itself. So Graeme, let's turn over the mic to you. We look forward to light you have to shed.
Thank you, Barrie. Speaking of light, do we have enough light here for the videographer? I spoke here once before, and I kept telling them to turn the light down because I wanted my slides to turn out well, and it was a bad decision. It didn't come out on video, so I assume people handling the light know what they're doing?
Yes, they do.
Okay, you do. Good. Thank you.
Well, it's fine the way it was.
All right, that's cool.
John? John? I think it was fine here.
Yeah, it was good.
I leave the decision to you folks.
Yeah.
I want to say, first of all, that I'm honored to be appearing today with Barrie Zwicker and with Geoff ONeill and with Amy MacPherson. I have great respect for all of these folks and have learned a lot from them and from their work. I want to thank Paul as well as Josh Manager for the organizing work that they've put into this and the funding. And I want to express my appreciation to all of you and to the people of Walkerton. I guess this is about the 4th time I've spoken here. I love this venue, and I always find people listen and speak respectfully, even though I dare say some of you think I'm nuts. But you never say it. And as they say, this is what democracy looks like, where we gather together and we talk to each other, and we respectfully dialogue, and together we try to figure out the truth about our world. And that's what I've been trying to do for years now, and I'm going to tell you some of the things that I think are true. It's not good news any more than Geoff's is good news. I was here last night, and what a wonderful celebration it was, all that music, and we were saying afterwards, what a shame we couldn't come and bring you some joy like that, some song and dance, and instead we're bringing you gloom and doom. But we're adults. We need to know what's going on. We need to face the hard truths. Now, what I'm doing today is to sketch an argument, to set out a few claims. I'm speaking fairly broadly, and won't be able to give you all the evidence to back it up. So I prepared a little one-page list of readings and films and put it on that table over there. And those of you who are interested in what I'm talking about and who might want to follow it up on your own, might want to take that one-pager and look at some of those things. Most of the articles and films can be found free on the internet. Okay, so time to get down to business. So I'm calling this War on Terror or War on Democracy, and the subtitle is Intimidating the Legislature. It's a fairly specific topic that is seldom talked about, even though it's very important. In my view, the war on terror is a fraud. Root and branch, from beginning to end, it is a fraud. I'll just be blunt with you about that. But of all the different frauds that are embraced in that concept, there's one that we especially need to think about, and that is that the war on terror threatens our democracy in quite a direct way. Now, legislatures, by that I mean elected assemblies of people. We elect them, and they do a number of things, but one of the most important is making laws. That's why we call them lawmakers. If anybody threatens and intimidates them, that is a direct threat to our representative democracy, as I've put it here. They make the rules, that is the laws. We agree to follow. Now, of course, we're told that, yeah, there have been some cases of the intimidation of legislatures. That means directly threatening with lethal violence people in our legislatures. But that it's the terrorists, that's what we're told. It's the terrorists that do that. As George W. Bush put it, they hate our freedoms. Because they hate our freedoms, and he's talking about extremist Muslims. We have to be very blunt here. It's Islam that's being targeted in the world. Because they threaten our democracy, we must, of course, fight back, and our fighting back is essentially defensive and so on. Well, no, I'm saying to you that if we look more carefully at the intimidation of our legislatures, and I'm using the term legislature quite broadly here, not just in Canada to refer to our provincial legislatures, but also to Parliament, we will find to our surprise that it is not Muslims primarily who have intimidated our legislatures. It is our own security and intelligence agencies. In order that certain people should have more power and certain others, including us, should have less. I've shown you two photographs on this slide. On the right is the Capitol in Washington, where U.S. Congress meets. And on the left is House of Parliament, center block, where our own House of Commons and Senate meet. And these are two different sets of cases of intimidation of legislatures that I'm going to very briefly sketch out for you. I'm going to take 4 examples, 2 from the US and 2 from Canada. And as I say, my talk will be rather broad, but I'm quite confident in my conclusions. We begin with the US intimidating Congress, 2 acts, both in the fall of 2001. The first one, you will remember, in other words, so-called 9/11 attacks, in which planes were flown into buildings and a variety of other things happened, which we were told were done by Muslim terrorists, and that this was very scary and shocking. It was indeed scary and shocking. There were about 3,000 people killed. There was nothing fake about that. They certainly were killed. And it led to a desire for social unity, which almost always happens after these kinds of traumatic events. Here's an embrace. George W. Bush embracing Tom Daschle. You know, I don't have anything against people hugging each other, and when you're attacked, it's a natural thing to do. If your family is attacked, you pull together as a group and you hug each other, and that's perfectly fine. But this is a dangerous hug, and you're going to see other dangerous hugs too. Tom Daschle, Senate Majority Leader and Democrat, was possibly the only man in the U.S. who could have stopped George W. Bush after 9/11. The Democrats had a majority of 1 in the Senate, and if they had opposed Mr. Bush, they would have thrown into disarray his plans to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, and they also could have prevented the passage of the Patriot Act. This is a dangerous hug because in a 9/11 memorial, Mr. Daschle had bought the story of 9/11, assumed that it was indeed done by Muslim terrorists, and essentially agreed to do what he saw as his patriotic duty. And he therefore agreed to actually be the one to propose a resolution in Congress that would permit force to be used. He didn't just allow it, he agreed to be the one to propose it. And there's something else that needs to be said here, and that is that Congress was not just indirectly intimidated and threatened on 9/11 like everybody else in the U.S. They were also told that there was a plane coming directly for the U.S. Capitol. Tom Daschle tells us in his memoirs he was there watching on TV as 9/11 unfolded like everybody else in the U.S. when the security officer ran into the room and said there's a plane headed toward the Capitol. And they scattered. And Daschle says for the first time in American history, the whole Capitol, all the elected representatives had to flee from the building. There was no protocol, there was no guidelines. They scattered to the 4 directions. Now that's intimidating the legislature. In that evening on 9/11, they came back and assembled, most of them, on the steps of the Capitol where a couple of little speeches were given. We don't have time to listen to those speeches, but I do want to show you some historically interesting and important footage from that event. When, after the speeches, they're filing away, and apparently spontaneously this happens. Well, I don't show it to make fun of them. When I watch it, I feel sad, sometimes even moved. There is a legislature, an elected body of lawmakers gathered, traumatized, scared like everybody else. As far as I can tell, most of them were fooled by that event, just like most of us were. And I have nothing against them hugging each other and singing the song. But there's a problem, and we should be aware of it. And that is that in moments of trauma, when that welling of emotion comes up in that patriotism, we may lose some of our critical thinking. And many of us did, not just U.S. Congress on that day. And we've got to get it back now. It's been 14 years. Time for grieving is over. Time for thinking is here. If we had had our thinking caps on at the time, the evidence was in fact all around us. If you look at that very same live broadcast, see where I put the red arrow at the bottom, the crawl is going by. That's the moving headline. New York Witness, quote, the whole thing came down like a glass house, talking about the World Trade Center. Well, we could perhaps be forgiven for not finding that peculiar. Most of us don't know much about buildings and how they're constructed. We didn't know how the plane hit it, how it weakened the building. But the time for that naivety is over. There's been 14 years of research. It came down like a glass house because it was blown up. That's why it came down like a glass house. And as far as I'm concerned, the evidence for this is now overwhelming. Let's wake up, folks. Let's go on to the next phase. I've given several talks here in Walkerton on that subject. I don't have time to do it today, but I've put a couple of items on the bibliography if you want to look into it. Now, what do you do with the population once you've intimidated them and made them scared and traumatized? And you then want them to pass bills that will restrict people's rights. You have to do it very quickly. Mr. Harper understands it. Mr. Bush understood it. You don't let them linger. You don't let them discuss these bills. You ram them through as quickly as you can, and that's exactly what was done with the Patriot Act in 2001. And in order to do it, in order to pull it off, they needed a second blow. 9/11 wasn't enough. People were starting to recover. Patriot Act was introduced. There was some opposition growing in Congress. There was opposition growing in the U.S. population. All over the ideological spectrum from left to right, there were people protesting. And so we had a second wave of attack, and this is when the letters containing deadly anthrax spores were sent out. Here's what the envelope on one of them looked like. You will notice it was sent to a senator, Senator Leahy, who happens to have been a Democratic senator, happened to have been the chairperson of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was considering the Patriot Act, and Leahy was being obstructionist. That is, according to Mr. Bush and company. He was slowing it down. And suddenly, directly after he began slowing it down, an anthrax letter was sent to him. And another anthrax letter was sent to Tom Daschle that we saw hugging Mr. Bush before because he supported his colleague, Senator Leahy. The two Democrats who could have stopped the Patriot Act immediately get anthrax letters. This is what the actual letter looked like to Mr. Leahy. 9/11, the date written right at the top, signed, hey, we're the same guys who attacked you on 9/11. You cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now. Are you afraid? What a taunt. What a blatant taunt. Death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. Well, obviously the sign is we're extremist Muslims, we're the guys that attacked you on 9/11, this is the second blow, you should be scared, and so on and so forth. Well, not surprisingly, many people concluded that these letters did come from Al-Qaeda. And a poll was conducted in October 2001, which showed that over 60% of the American population had reached that conclusion. Okay, almost finished my first half, Barrie. So most people thought it was Al-Qaeda. But another hypothesis quickly reared its head, and that is that although Al-Qaeda provided the foot soldiers to send the letters, the spores themselves came from a state supplier, namely Iraq. And here's Mr. McCain, Senator.
How are things going in Afghanistan now?
I think we're doing fine. I think we'll do fine. The second phase, if I just move very quickly, the second phase is Iraq. There is some indication, and I don't have the conclusions, but some of this anthrax may, and I'm sorry, may have come from Iraq.
Oh, is that right?
If that may be the case, then that's when some tough decisions are going to have to be made.
Tough decisions are going to have to be made is code for we're going to attack Iraq next. So where did the anthrax come from? Iraq or Al-Qaeda? The answer is neither. This story fell apart very rapidly. And by the end of 2001, just a few months after the attacks, it was admitted by the FBI, Homeland Security, the White House, that there was a, quote, domestic source of the anthrax. In other words, it was an inside job, and it came from a highly secure laboratory serving the military and intelligence community in the United States. I'm not going to give more details about this now because I discuss it in the book, which Barrie mentioned in some detail. But my conclusion is that the same people who did 9/11 did the anthrax attacks, and they used them both to get the Patriot Act passed, and the connection is extremely direct. And the senators, they were forced out of the Hart Senate building by anthrax spores. House of Representatives at one point fled Washington. The anthrax attacks were used to get that act passed, and as you know, to support two invasions, the second of which was the invasion of Iraq, a devastating thing that Geoff mentioned. But when you think about war and you're asked to vote for war, you might want to think of the face of the little girl in the middle there. And that's the face of war, to me. At least 1 million Iraqis killed since that invasion. And if you add to that the 2 million, roughly, that were killed in the preceding decade, you get about 3 million Iraqis dead, who knows how many wounded and made refugee. At what point does this become a Holocaust? For those of you in Walkerton, let me especially remind you that during the 1990s, the US deliberately, consciously destroyed the water supply system and sewage system in Iraq, with the resulting deaths of several 100,000 children under the age of 5. You want to see terrorism? That's arguably genocide. Now, of course, I'm running a bit over time as usual. We move to Canada. We begin with the case, two Canadian cases here. First, the BC legislature. You perhaps remember that in Canada Day, that is July 1st, 2013, 3 bombs were discovered on the grounds of the BC legislature. Talk about intimidating legislatures. And who were the guilty? Well, their trial is going on right now, but the accused are John Nuttall and Amanda Corridy, his common-law wife, who had kind of self-converted to Islam a couple of years previously. They are heroin addicts, very poor people on the fringes of Vancouver society, discovered a book on Islam in a bookstore somewhere and decided to become Muslims, rejected by the mainstream Muslim community, which in fact reported them to the police. So who are these dangerous people? We're told in Canada that terrorism is Canada's #1 national security threat. So you're seeing Canada's #1 national security threat here. 2 pathetic heroin addicts. And let's go, those are the bombs. Let's go straight to the question, who chose the bombs and who chose the location? Who's responsible for intimidating the legislature? It's a sad answer. The RCMP had 240 officers working for 4 months to get these pathetic characters to become credible terrorists. They suggested, the RCMP suggested pressure cooker bombs. They supplied C4, the explosive for the bombs. They chose the legislature. They drove this pathetic guy around town and showed him a nice place behind the bushes on the legislature where he could put his bombs. I want to quote to you. This to me was quite striking. This came out in the trial. Poor old Nuttall had been assigned by the jihadi who befriended him, who of course wasn't a jihadi, he's an RCMP agent in disguise. He'd been informed to come up with a realistic terrorist plan. He came up with his usual fantasy plan. The guy's feet were never on the ground securely. So the RCMP agent balls him out, dresses him down, tells him he's got to get realistic, and then says, I'm here to make what you have in your head come true. So that's the role of the RCMP? Is that what the Canadian state now does. They look for our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities. They seduce and beguile and entrap us, because that's what they did to John Nuttall. I'm here to make what you have in your head come true. In other words, I'll help you make a bomb. I'll show you where to put it. He goes on, brother, trust me for once. Well, that was good advice. Do you understand? Trust me for once. When I say something, don't... What? Now you're going to start crying? As poor old John Nuttall, heroin addict, his wife vomiting blood as she tries to get over her addiction to taking methadone, wipes away his tears as he's being dressed down by the fake jihadi. I consider this just outrageous. And I hope if the jury puts these two in jail, they will save 240 cells for the RCMP agents that helped put them there. It'll be a dark day in Canada if this kind of legal process is allowed. And we have to be careful, because the FBI does this all the time. I don't have time to go into it, but this book is in my bibliography. This journalist studied 500 cases of people that were implicated in terrorism-related charges in the US, and only about 1% of them were actual terrorists, in the sense that we would use the word. Police agents were involved time and time again, picking up what some journalist has called human wreckage and turning them into people who could then be thrown in jail for 20 years. This is a scam. And if they need to do this to come up with terrorists, then that's just another sign the war on terror is a fraud. Moving along, even if you don't remember the legislature attacks, you will probably all remember the terrorist incidents last October, one on October the 20th in the province of Quebec, and the next one, which was even more memorable, was in fact extremely dramatic and made very good television, was on October 22nd. This is the fellow, presumably, Geoff Bibot. If I had time, I would tell you a little bit about this photograph, but I don't, so let's go on. Now this was the kind of television Canadians were not used to. We're inside Parliament, we're in the Hall of Honor. We have the Conservative caucus meeting on the left-hand side of the Hall of Honor, and the NDP barricaded in their room on the right, when a man runs with a loaded weapon. And we get to watch all this. We're not used to that. Again, that is such a classic case of the intimidation of the legislature. There's no doubt about it. But of course, there are questions remaining. Before we get to those, we get the hugs. We don't have a very huggy Prime Minister, but he broke his usual rule. He's hugging Mr. Mulcair and Mr. Trudeau. And it means pretty much the same, I think, as it did in the US. It doesn't really mean just unity, it means obedience. I expect you now to stop disagreeing with me and to pass the bills that I propose. That's what it means. We had a moment in the House of Parliament which was just as dramatic as God Bless America on the steps of the Capitol, when the Sergeant at Arms carrying the mace, which represents the authority of Parliament, apparently shot the perpetrator in the head and killed him. And of course was promptly named the ambassador to Ireland by the Prime Minister. In the meantime, watch the House of Commons celebrate the killing of the perpetrator. This is the day after the attack. historic footage. It's like God Bless America on the steps of the Capitol. This is extraordinary footage. Here is Kevin Vickers. I have no reason to believe that the story is false. As far as I know, he did shoot the suspect. I have no reason to believe that Mr. Vickers was doing something evil or that he was involved in an evil plot, so I don't want to give that impression. I actually don't know what his role was. He refuses to talk about what he actually did, and there are many mysteries around the killing of Mr. Geoff Bibot. That very violent footage that you watched, that dramatic footage with all those bullets going off, I should point out that as far as I've been able to tell, and I've spent several months researching this, when Geoff Bibot ran into Parliament, he was on a martyrdom operation. He knew he wouldn't emerge alive. He had a rifle designed in 1894. He had a maximum of 3, possibly 4 bullets in his rifle, and as far as we know, did not reload at any point. And of those bullets you heard, at most 2 were his. He may have even been fatally wounded and may not have fired at all during that barrage. So out of the roughly 50 shots fired, he may have fired 3. This isn't to say he was, a good guy and I'm on his side and all this sort of thing. As far as I can tell, he murdered Nathan Cirillo. But this is an extraordinary incident that needs to be investigated. On October 20th and 22nd, the alleged perpetrators were killed by the police with multiple shots. Geoff Bibot was probably shot 20 times. And therefore there will be no trial. And unlike the case of Nuttall and Cormody, there will be no public airing of the evidence. At least that's the current thinking. The police are carrying out investigations, but it's up to them. It's up to them. I find this extraordinary as to how much they're going to release to us. Well, we don't have time, I'm afraid, to go through Mr. Harper's speech, which he gave on that very day, October 22nd, but I did pick a few phrases from his speech, and I will comment briefly. I taught peace studies for years, and I taught students about what that means, what war is, what characterizes it, and I can tell you that that speech is a war speech. That's what leaders do. We're good, and our soil, our homeland is sacred. The evil, inhuman, savage has tainted and despoiled us. And we must gather together as a body and fling ourselves upon it. In the meantime, sacrificing certain of our rights. That's a war speech. And it led, of course, just as Mr. Bush's did, to both an internal and an external movement. Internally, we got a series of bills. The third one, Bill C-51, is about to be passed. And again, it gives security and intelligence services more power, and it gives us less. Externally, you'll see that this is the mission in Iraq, which now has a new base called Cirillo. Nathan Cirillo being his name. Cirillo was, of course, murdered on October 22nd. His name already being exploited to justify the military mission. And, of course, Mr. Harper wasted no time in extending that mission to Syria. It's now bombing Syria. It's completely against international law. So we find the same movement that we found in the United States. Internally, our rights are cut down. Externally, foreign invasions. And yet, many big questions remain, including the suppressed possibility, which the media refuse to even discuss, as far as I can tell. The politicians refuse to discuss, the academics refuse to discuss, and that is that Geoff Bibot on the right may have been a managed terrorist like John Nuttall the 2013 bomber on the left. 2 drug addicts from Vancouver, thinking of themselves as Muslims, but being expelled essentially by the actual Muslim mainstream community. Both seeing themselves as wanting to be holy warriors, and both, in my view, managed by security and intelligence. I can't prove that yet. Maybe I never will be able to, but I'm writing a report on it, which I hope will be out soon. I think we've been swindled again. I believe I'm now over my time. Okay, so I'll just end briefly by saying to Commissioner Paulson of the RCMP, we have some questions. We're not satisfied yet. You haven't told us where he got his weapons, and that's a biggie, because in a lot of these fake events, the intelligence and security agencies are the ones that supply the weapons. Just like they supplied the C4 to poor old John Nuttall and told him to make pressure cooker bombs. So I want to know how he got his weapons. I want to know how this homeless man got a car. I want to know where he got the knife, the gun, the bullets. He may have had a bulletproof vest. If he did, where did he get it? I want to know. And I don't want to just hear we've got it figured out. I want to see the evidence. And that's the problem when you kill somebody, when the police kill somebody. You don't get a trial. Don't get to see the evidence. And that's a big problem. I also want to know why Commissioner Paulson lied to us and said that the RCMP had absolutely no warning. That story fell apart pretty quickly. They had a very specific warning. It was put together by the Integrated Threat Assessment Center, which includes the RCMP, and was issued by the Privy Council office just a few days before these 2 events, saying they were worried about a violent event of terrorism in Canada, and the threat was sent to the legislatures, the provincial legislatures. And one of them told us that he was told there might be an event this week, the week of the 2 attacks. It was a very specific warning. Well, why was the legislature in BC told to be careful and to raise its threat level a notch when somehow Parliament did not apparently prepare? And we had this terrorist driving his car past 2 RCMP vehicles, having hijacked the car at gunpoint on Parliament Hill. And the RCMP slowly followed him and didn't even phone ahead to House of Commons Security to tell them there's a guy on with a rifle coming. Nothing. I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to say we have some questions, Mr. Paulson. We're not done with October 22nd. We're not convinced. We're going to look into it. We're going to insist on asking these questions. And I sum up by saying to you, there is a pattern here. And I think the pattern is the war on terror does indeed involve intimidating our legislatures. It does indeed involve a threat to our representatives' democracy, but that appears to come not from foreign Muslims or even domestic Muslims, but from inside our countries, and that's a problem. Thank you.
Everybody. So yes, I am a journalist, and that means that normally I'm the one writing the script. And today I wanted to speak to you just very personally, so that you know I didn't come here, with it all prepared and how I'd spin it and the way I was explaining it. This is just very genuine from my heart, from the work that I do, that I believe in, the drive that I have to keep doing it. And the gentlemen that have gone before me have addressed a lot of issues about the media and what amounts to its integrity and its tenacity about going after these stories. And to be honest, they're just not anymore. We're not as a group. We're absolutely failing Canada as the fourth estate, and I would never deny those words at any time. This is one of my biggest beefs. And I used to report politics for CBC, both online and on television. And it was after Harper got his majority government in 2011 when my contract expired, it was not renewed. I was told they didn't need my type of reporting anymore. And I had done investigative journalism for them as well. I wasn't the only one. There was a huge exodus. There are a lot of names left. But this is to give you some idea of my background. And so that's why I started my site called freethepresscanada.org. And you'll see some investigations that I have published there since. And one of those is the reason why I'm specifically here today. It was about, I wrote a piece called Government Passes Anti-Constitutional Surveillance Law During Ottawa Shooting. What I'm talking about is the cyberbullying bill, C-13. It was one of the most controversial pieces of legislation that we had. There was a tremendous amount of protest about this. And what it amounts to was it was giving the government power to surveil us online, and especially through social media, and a lot more than 7 degrees of separation. I also have another investigative piece on my website about that. That one's called Surveillance of Judges and Journalists Has Ties to the NSA. And it does directly, and of course CSIP as well. I would advise that as some background reading material to really get a feel for what journalists are up against nowadays. We are actually being monitored by our government. Harper spent $20 million from 2012 to 2014 to create what I personally and colloquially refer to as the Ministry of Truth. So 3,300 people were brought on staff of the government to peruse the internet and to figure out, who's talking about what and exactly where it's going. So when I write something, there are specific media surveillance programs, and the European Commission has one as well, so this is not unique to North America. But it's quite an interesting situation. So what they do is they look at my influence and how many of you actually read me, and then how many of you share, what comments are made about that. It's even run through a semantics diagnostics to see whether you're supportive of what I said or you're criticizing it, to see if I've convinced you to get on board with my line of thinking. And then every single person that you talk to about it as well. I think that's a very serious intrusion of privacy, and we need to modernize what our rights and protections are since the digital age has come along. This is one of the greatest issues I think we're facing now, and it sort of culminates through everything that we've been talking about today, and specifically this Bill C-13 cyberbullying bill. Amanda Todd's mom even spoke out against it. It was that controversial. She said, basically, in a nutshell, you're not going to use my daughter to turn this into a surveillance state. She was very vocal about that. But instead of that debate continuing, on Monday, October 20th, 2014, there was a shooting in Quebec. And that was when the first one started, before the Parliament Hill shooting. And it was really quite interesting to give you some idea of what is happening in our media today, even sources that we feel are quite trustworthy. There's a reason why I am now going to be publishing outside of Canada for the next expose that I have to bring, and I'll tell you a little bit about that at the end. So during the Quebec shooting that was apparently against 2 soldiers and Muslim extremists motivated. The original story that went out on the Toronto Star, it was derived from French press as well, from Quebec, and the French press never did back down on their take of it, and they interviewed witnesses that were on scene immediately. They are the only source to this day that will still provide you with that information. And the Toronto Star, it did originally report its story as I would think ethically it should have, based on the facts. 5 major reporters, long-standing, very well-known names. They put this together. And I would like to read to you the original copy. I had to get the original out of Internet Archives because it was edited and altered completely for the entire gist of its content by the very next day. So the original entry had stated, Montreal, the suspect in a hit and run that injured 2 Canadian soldiers in Quebec, an incident identified as a possible terror attack, has died in hospital after being shot several times by police. Lieutenant Michel Brunet of the Sûreté du Québec says the 25-year-old man identified as Martin Rouleau died a few hours after being shot in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, southwest of Montreal. The shocking incident, which occurred at about noon Monday, also sent 2 Canadian Armed Forces personnel to hospital, with one fighting for his life and the other having suffered minor injuries, according to the Quebec Provincial Police. The 2 soldiers were reportedly walking through the parking lot of a shopping center located less than 3 kilometers from a military college and French language university run by the Department of National Defense, when they were run down by a driver. A police chase ensued, and the car drove into a ditch after the driver lost control of the vehicle, police said. Witnesses who spoke with the TVA network Monday afternoon said they saw a man emerge from the flipped vehicle that was lying in a ditch on the side of the road. The man had his hands in the air and was walking toward police when at least one officer opened fire on the suspect. The witnesses said they heard up to 7 gunshots. TVA also showed images, actual photographs, of the knife with an elaborate handle lodged into the ground near where the incident occurred. A source told the Toronto Star that the incident happened near the Integrated Personnel Support Center. So I'll leave it at that. That was Monday, October 20th. On that day, Bill C-13 passed in the House of Commons. There was 0 coverage from any outlet except CBC bothered to say that it was progressing. They didn't say it had passed, they said it was progressing. And the news was dominated by this alleged terror attack. By the very next day, Tuesday, October 21st, 2014, the story was edited. It now reads, as Rouleau fled from the scene, La Presse reported he called a 911 dispatcher and explained that he was acting in the name of Allah. All of this happened with local police chasing him along one of the town's main thoroughfares and into a residential area where Rouleau lost control of his vehicle, flipped, and landed upside down in a ditch. He reportedly emerged from the overturned car with a knife in his hands and a threat that drew gunfire from police. All witness accounts were deleted. These are factually opposing statements. And the first version was written by 5 longtime Toronto Star reporters collaborating together, also with the French press, with actual photographs and video on site of what happened. Also on Tuesday, October 21st, the very next day after C-13 passed, it went for its reading in Senate. There was 0 news report about C-13 again. Then on Wednesday, October 22nd, we had the Ottawa shooting, which is what I covered right away. I knew that coverage wasn't exactly as ethical as it should have been to date in what was happening around the Ottawa area, and with accusations of terrorism and Muslim extremism. And so what I noticed was CBS News, I believe it was about 10:54 a.m., they had reported the name, the shooter. They said, "The gunman has been identified by U.S. officials to CBS News as Michael Zehak Bilu, a Canadian national born in 1982. A few hours later, that story was edited. It then removed his name, said that the information was unknown. About 5 hours after that, the story was edited again, and it said that the information about the fellow's name was actually provided by the Canadian government, and it included a tremendous amount of emphasis on a middle name, Abdul, and saying that he didn't really go by Michael or Michelle. It really focused on Abdul in the Muslim context to foster that idea of the extremism. Now, as that was happening, all parliamentary bureau chiefs that were on the Hill that day were actually at gunpoint. And they were tweeting at the time. They were actually being held at gunpoint. And the video that was shown just prior about that, showing, police shooting in the hallways. What was really interesting about that is that Josh Wingrove from the Globe and Mail was there to report it beside them as the only reporter who was there while everybody else was at gunpoint, including Katie O'Malley from CBC. So by 1:14 p.m., our reporters still didn't know what was going on. Half of them were still in lockup. The entire town was locked down. Nobody knew what was going on. This is 10:54 a.m. that the U.S. was reporting what happened to us. We were still under the belief that there might be a second shooter. There was a lot of talk about that. There were reporters in Ottawa who were tweeting about that. This was all the news that they had been told. They needed to be careful of this for their own safety. They believed there was another person, at least one more on the loose. So then the next day, Thursday, October 23rd, well, actually, sorry, I'm just going to get back to one more thing here. It was a month later that Liberal Senator Celine Hervieux-Payette published her diary of what happened that day. And it absolutely supported my investigation and contradicted the Harper government and the US government. So at noon, which is an hour after the US report, she was still on lockdown, and there was word of a second suspect running around Parliament. At 2:30 p.m., she was still in lockdown, but by this point, the military police had taken control of Parliament and were holding senators and their assistants at gunpoint. They were taken to another location within the building where glass was smashed, and to really instill the fear of that situation and believing that this may still be going on. 2:30 p.m. yet. By 5:36 p.m., an officer repeated directly from his earpiece, "We are still looking for 3 suspects." And this is according to a Liberal senator, documenting every last thing in the moment that is happening. It's on her blog. It's linked within my story on Free the Press Canada, so anybody could get straight to it from there. And I would really advise reading it, because our senators obviously are not in a good position these days with the DEPA scandal going on and how we exactly feel about the Senate. She's not in a position to really take a battle on like this herself. But I did speak with her, and she very clearly published this because it's the truth and she wants people to know it. So by 7:45 p.m., you had seen on the video, Harper gave a speech, and it was described as what would be a war speech. At that moment, our senators were still on lockdown, 50 of them crammed into a single room with 4 to 6 chairs. And they were escorted out on 15-minute intervals in small groups to go to the bathroom, and that's all they were allowed to do in that time. They were given no other information. This whole time, the story has already been released by the US. Now, our media that is free was reporting what came from the US, and it was basically dictated to us. It wasn't until 8 p.m. when she was finally set free, along with the other senators. So that's what happened on Wednesday. On Thursday, the following day, Bill C-13 was back in front of the Senate in just about record-breaking time for any legislation in the free world, and it passed royal assent. And we gave away our privacy rights. We gave the Harper government the right to surveil us in our homes, on the internet, who we speak to, who our friends speak to, for as far as you could possibly imagine if you have an opinion on politics. And this has never been allowed to be discussed by anyone in our media since. The story is put to bed. There seems, everybody seems to wonder if there's some control over media. Well, Harper got his majority. He brought in 12 of 14 board members at CBC that were Conservative Party donors. The Conservative Party main operatives in them, including former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, head up all post-media products. That covers the vast majority of anything you could read online. The ONeill is also directly connected to the Conservative Party. And so that you understand a little bit about journalism, it's called the fourth estate because it has a very specific purpose in a functioning democracy. It is here to hold the government to account, to keep it honest. It cannot do that when it's affected by partisanship and partisan ownership for that matter. I don't understand how we can allow this. I don't understand why no one's speaking about it. I know that my colleagues are losing their jobs, so dropping off like flies. There's just about nowhere left to go. You'll see a lot of different startups like freethepresscanada.org. But anybody worth their salt has had to leave and try and start up themselves just to be able to report again. And everybody that's still there is being told what they can and can't write. And sometimes that's coming from a different country. So that's the near past, and I'm not going to take up too much time talking today. It's quite a lot to digest when you really think about that, and I would like you to, so I don't want to overload you with too much information about all the details, all the ins and outs going on behind the scenes. I could go on for days about that. These are the core matters. You need to learn. You need to know them like the back of your hand. And you need to start talking to your parliamentarians and to your media outlets. You need to speak up, you need to complain. This isn't going to change if you don't. With the internet, it's been a bit of a double-edged sword because yes, it gives us more access to information, but that information can also be changed in the blink of an eye. It's gotten to the point that when a story breaks, you really do need to screen cap it because it could be entirely different by the next day. This is our historical record for what we are basing public opinion and making our laws on and what really matters to be talking about in Parliament. So with that said, I'm going to bring us up to the current because we've had quite a view of this, from Vietnam War coming all the way up to the Ottawa shooting, but it's still going on now. And I can't give you a tremendous amount of details about the next expose that I'm about to break, but it will be the biggest work of my entire career. And you can't get intimidated as a journalist. You're a human being like anybody else. You process your feelings, but you can't let that get to you and stop you from what you're doing. And I can honestly say this one kept me from eating, it kept me from sleeping, it kept me from really being able to communicate with my friends for a little bit as I was trying to digest it all. It needed to be processed before I could inform everybody else. So the current war in Iraq against ISIS, known by many terms. We were told that veterans are volunteering to go and fight with Kurds. It's far more complex than this. I have ties directly to our government, directly to the Prime Minister's office, and directly to the American military. I would say that it's a very private unit. Everything about it is being kept anonymous, although they've managed to register it as a miracle charity. So if you could picture Blackwater as a charity, Canada now has this. And I will be giving you the full details on that very soon. And the last little bit that I will leak to you, because I really do want you to keep watching for it, not because of my ego, not because of my work, because we're Canadians and we really do need to respond. I will be showing you that it is also connected to Sergeant Dwarman's death and that he was involved with this very group directly, and that evidence was altered to conceal that relationship. That's everything for now.